truth was just beginning.
August 9th, 1945, Tokyo. The lights flicker in the underground corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of sweat, dust, and burnt wiring from a night of electrical strain. Above ground, scattered air raid sirens moan faintly across a wounded capital, their echoes drifting through broken windows and shattered rooftops. Inside the war room, officers stand over maps that no longer resemble a nation in control. Reports from Manchuria lie open, Soviet forces pushing relentlessly across borders once thought secure. Telegraph machines chatter in uneven bursts. Most of the messages are routine: damage assessments, fuel shortages, troop withdrawals, the usual symptoms of a collapsing front. Then one courier stops running. A single sheet trembles in his hand as he steps toward the duty officer. The room quiets, not out of ceremony, but out of exhaustion, instinct, and dread. The report is fragmented, barely a paragraph, but every word lands like a weight on the table. Nagasaki, unknown type of bomb. Extreme devastation, single aircraft, unprecedented blast. For a moment, no one speaks. Only the clicking of machines fills the silence, steady, indifferent, mechanical. A second atomic catastrophe was unfolding, and the war room had no space left for disbelief. And this is where the larger story begins. In the final summer of the Second World War, Japan stood in a position its leaders had once considered unthinkable. The empire that had stretched from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the cold waters of the Aleutians was now shrinking by the week, crushed under the combined weight of American naval power, relentless strategic bombing, and an increasingly desperate economy. By August 1945, Tokyo was no longer the confident command center of a vast Pacific domain. It had become a bunker, physically and psychologically. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, the senior leadership gathered daily beneath layers of concrete designed to withstand conventional bombs. These meetings were no longer about victory or expansion. They were about survival. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Transportation networks had been shattered by B-29 raids. Factories struggled to operate without electricity, rubber, or steel. Food rations had been reduced multiple times, and entire regions faced malnutrition. The empire's armies still fought in scattered pockets across Asia, but the strategic picture was unmistakably grim. 3 days earlier, Hiroshima had vanished. The High Command had received the first reports with confusion. The blast pattern did not match any known American weapon. Entire districts vaporized in seconds, a column of light that scorched shadows into concrete. But even with these descriptions, many top officers doubted that a single bomb could do such damage. They suspected a new type of incendiary device, or perhaps a magnesium-based airburst engineered to incinerate city centers. The phrase atomic bomb appeared in some briefings, but without a clear understanding of nuclear physics, the term seemed abstract, almost theoretical. World War II had conditioned the Japanese leadership to believe in the scale of modern firepower, but not in the possibility of a single weapon capable of erasing a city. Hiroshima had stunned them, yet disbelief remained a shield against panic. At the same time, another disaster was unfolding on the northern frontier. On August 8th, only a day before Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched massive assaults into Manchuria. This alone had the potential to change the entire course of the conflict. For years, Tokyo had clung to the faint hope that Moscow might mediate a peace settlement with the United States and Britain. Now that hope evaporated in hours, replaced by reports of Soviet armored columns moving with brutal speed across territories Japan had taken in earlier, more confident days. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, Japan's top decision-making body, was deeply divided. Military hardliners believed the empire must fight on, inflicting enough casualties on the Americans during the anticipated invasion of the home islands to force more favorable surrender terms. They spoke of decisive battles, of the spirit of the nation, of sacrifice. Others, particularly within the foreign ministry, understood the reality. Japan could not withstand an American invasion, nor endure another round of annihilating air raids. Still, they held their ground, bound by tradition, fear, and the overwhelming sense of duty that shaped every decision. Pride remained a powerful force, even as defeat drew close. Across the Pacific, the United States prepared Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu. Japanese intelligence intercepted fragments of these preparations, reinforcing the belief that a catastrophic battle loomed. The High Command expected the invasion to begin in late 1945 or early 1946. Every calculation, every defensive map, every allocation of remaining resources revolved around that prediction. But the atomic bombing of Hiroshima disrupted those timelines. It introduced an unknown element, an American weapon capable of bypassing defenses, neutralizing entire divisions without landing a single soldier. And yet doubts persisted. Was Hiroshima a unique event? Could the United States produce more of these weapons? Or was this a solitary demonstration meant to force psychological submission? Those questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the High Command gathered on the morning of August 9th. Officers studied charts detailing coastal fortifications. Staff members debated troop redistribution in Kyushu. Senior generals weighed the incoming reports from Manchuria. Hiroshima's devastation lingered in their minds, but not as an existential threat, only as a brutal warning they hoped would not be repeated. Even now, in the quiet, humid August morning, many believed the war could be prolonged, that Japan could negotiate surrender terms protecting the imperial institution and avoiding occupation. They believed there was more time. It was an illusion that would not last. Because even as they worked through their schedules, even as they argued over defensive lines and communiques, an American B-29 named Boxcar was already approaching its target. And in a few hours, the High Command's assumptions about Hiroshima being a singular event would collapse completely. The war room had not yet realized that the second message, far more devastating, was already on its way. The hours before the Nagasaki report reached Tokyo carried a deceptive calm. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers moved with the weary precision of men who had repeated the same routines for months. Messages arrived through telegraph lines still functioning despite the damaged infrastructure. Field reports from China, the Philippines, and the home islands stacked neatly on polished wooden tables, giving the illusion of order in a war now defined by chaos. But beneath the routine, tension simmered. Japan's intelligence networks, once extensive, were fractured by the collapse of its foreign positions. Communication lines had been severed or overrun. Radio operators struggled to maintain consistent contact with regional commands. And the devastation in Hiroshima had destabilized information flows even further. Entire regiments disappeared from records. Civil authorities were gone or unreachable. The city itself had become a blank space on the map, a level of destruction so absolute that traditional intelligence structures simply failed. In the days before Nagasaki, officers in Tokyo tried to reconstruct the Hiroshima event from scattered transmissions. Pilots described a blinding flash visible from miles away. Train conductors reported stations obliterated. Survivors spoke of heat so intense it fused metal, turned clothing into ash, and left skin with patterns of the garments burned onto it. But even these eyewitness accounts felt unreal. They contradicted everything the High Command believed about conventional warfare. The word atomic appeared again and again in foreign broadcasts, including those from Washington and London. Neutral nations transmitted their own analyses. Japanese scientists at the Riken Institute and other research centers attempted to interpret the findings, comparing them to theoretical studies conducted years earlier. But the information remained incomplete, speculative, and difficult to verify. In the war room, the senior leaders leaned on familiar assumptions that the Americans could not possibly have a large stockpile of such bombs, that manufacturing one must require immense resources and rare materials, and that strategic bombing with conventional B-29 raids would remain the United States' primary method of destruction. However catastrophic Hiroshima had been, many believed it was an extraordinary attack, not one that could be repeated on short notice. This belief was reinforced by the Japanese military's long-standing view of American industrial limitations, views that had not kept pace with reality. Tokyo had underestimated the scale at which the United States had mobilized. They were unaware that the Manhattan Project had been the largest scientific and industrial program in world history. They did not know that the U.S. had produced more enriched uranium and plutonium than they imagined technologically feasible, and they could not have imagined that another bomb, based on a completely different design, was already prepared for deployment. The leadership that morning was focused on a different crisis, the Soviet invasion. Reports arriving from Manchuria described armored spearheads moving with astonishing speed, overwhelming defensive positions, capturing key rail junctions. For years, Japanese defensive planning had revolved around the belief that the Kwantung Army could hold the Soviet Union at bay long enough for diplomatic negotiations to proceed, but the reality was stark. The Kwantung Army was hollow, stripped over time of its best units to support struggles in the Pacific and China. The Soviet attack shattered the illusion of a stable northern frontier. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo recognized instantly what this meant. Without Soviet neutrality, Japan had no diplomatic path left. The United States, Britain, and China had already delivered the Potsdam Declaration demanding unconditional surrender. Now that the Soviets were at war with Japan, there was no possible mediator. The empire faced a two-front collapse. Inside GHQ, however, the Army leadership clung to the prospect of decisive battle on the home islands. Operation Ketsugo, the defense of Kyushu and Honshu, remained their focus. They envisioned mobilizing the entire civilian population, deploying last reserves, even arming students and workers for a national struggle. They believed Japan could inflict enough casualties to force the Allies into negotiating more favorable terms, but the Hiroshima bomb had already damaged the credibility of this plan, and the Soviet invasion had further weakened it. Yet the High Command still believed Japan might endure a few more months. The missing variable, the one that would obliterate all these assumptions, was the second atomic bomb. And it was this variable that was now moving toward them at the speed of a telegraph key. At approximately the same time the GHQ's morning briefings began in Tokyo, the first scrambled messages from Nagasaki and the Western Army District Command were being prepared. Observers on the ground saw the flash, heard the shock wave, and witnessed the massive plume rise over a city that had been almost untouched compared to other industrial centers. Their first reports were confused, incomplete, and unmistakably catastrophic. Those fragmented transmissions were already flowing toward the capital, flickering through damaged telegraph lines and radio relays, carrying news that would destroy the last illusions of Japan's ability to continue the war. And soon, those messages would enter the war room. By the time the Nagasaki reports began to arrive, the Imperial General Headquarters had already been pushed to the edge of comprehension. The city of Hiroshima was still a smoldering ghost in their minds, and the Northern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Yet the High Command faced a challenge more subtle than any battlefield. They were being forced to interpret an entirely new kind of warfare, one that tested not just strategy, but perception itself. Angle 1, tactical and military reality. From a purely strategic standpoint, Nagasaki shattered every assumption the Japanese military had clung to. Before August 9th, the leaders had calculated defense based on massed troops, fortified positions, and the projected rate of American bombing campaigns. Hiroshima had been anomalous, a terrifying anomaly, but perhaps an isolated incident. Now the second strike revealed a terrifying pattern. The Americans possessed a capability to inflict city-level destruction with unprecedented speed and precision, bypassing conventional defenses entirely. High-ranking officers quickly realized that their remaining military units could no longer deter the enemy. Coastal defenses, anti-aircraft artillery, and dispersed infantry formations were all irrelevant against a single B-29 carrying a nuclear payload. The bomb did not simply destroy infrastructure, it invalidated the core logic of Japanese military planning. Fortresses and redoubts, once symbols of control, now appeared tragically obsolete. Every calculation about delaying or attriting the enemy's forces was suddenly meaningless. In those moments, GHQ officers began to understand that the war had entered a new dimension, a level of destruction where traditional tactics could not protect cities, armies, or morale. The implications were clear. Conventional defense was no longer sufficient, and surrender was no longer a matter of choice, but of inevitability. Angle 2, leadership reaction. The arrival of the Nagasaki message tested the composure of the nation's top leaders. Figures such as General Yoshijiro Umezu, War Minister Korochika Anami, and Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo faced an existential crisis. Within the austere walls of the war room, the usual ritual of military discipline collided with panic, disbelief, and the weight of responsibility. Anami, a figure long committed to the Bushido principle of unwavering sacrifice, recognized that the country could not continue fighting without annihilating itself. Umezu, who had long advocated for a continued struggle, could no longer reconcile the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with any credible military plan. Togo, representing the diplomatic perspective, saw the opportunity and the necessity for immediate surrender. The dynamics between these leaders were fraught. Even in this critical moment, factions within the military sought to minimize the impact of the atomic bombs, framing Nagasaki as a single, extreme case rather than the start of a new strategic reality. Yet beneath the surface, the psychological shock was undeniable. The leadership had seen the unimaginable and understood that no amount of traditional planning could counter it. The balance between hope, fear, and pragmatism was fractured, leaving a void in which critical decisions would soon have to be made. Angle 3, human and moral perspective. Beyond tactics and leadership, the human cost of the bombs weighed heavily on the high command, at least in calculated acknowledgement. Japanese officers had been trained to view war through strategy and sacrifice, but the images and reports from Nagasaki transcended military thinking. Buildings vaporized, families erased, shadows burned into stone, civilian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Even for men conditioned by decades of militaristic indoctrination, the scale of destruction was morally staggering. Officers debated the implications not just for cities, but for the societal order itself. In a culture where surrender was equated with shame, the moral weight of continuing the war against such overwhelming odds became nearly unbearable. The human suffering inflicted by one weapon forced reflection, even if outward expressions were minimal. This awareness fed directly into the internal divisions of the high command. Could the nation endure another such strike? Could Japan risk a third, fourth, or fifth atomic attack on major population centers? The stark realization of vulnerability, combined with the moral horror of civilian annihilation, added an emotional dimension to decisions that were, until now, framed solely by military logic. The GHQ now faced a nexus of forces: tactical impotence, fractured leadership, and unprecedented human devastation. All three converged to challenge Japan's ability to continue the war as it had been conducted for decades. Yet even with this understanding, the full implications of the atomic age had not yet crystallized. With the initial shock of Nagasaki's destruction reverberating through the war room, the High Command confronted dimensions of the crisis that went beyond human suffering or tactical failure. These next angles, technological, enemy perception, and geopolitical, would deepen the understanding that Japan's situation had passed a point of conventional recovery. Angle 4, Technological Shock. The atomic bomb represented a leap in warfare that Japan's leaders had never truly anticipated. Even after Hiroshima, many in the GHQ considered it a singular demonstration, a horrifying anomaly, perhaps achievable only once under extraordinary circumstances. Nagasaki dispelled this illusion. For the first time, the High Command confronted the reality that the United States could deploy multiple atomic weapons, potentially in rapid succession. Japan's intelligence reports began to calculate production, but available data suggested that the Americans were capable of sustaining an atomic offensive. The implications were terrifying. No city, no defensive fortification, no concentration of troops could withstand this technology. Traditional doctrines of attrition, fortification, and sacrifice were obsolete. This technological revelation forced the leaders to rethink every military assumption. Air defenses, long thought to offer some deterrent against B-29 raids, were ineffective. Anti-aircraft artillery could not penetrate the high-altitude delivery of atomic weapons, and even the dispersed fighter units stretched thin across the home islands were irrelevant against a single plane delivering destruction on a scale never before imagined. The world had changed in minutes, and Japan's leadership had to confront a new reality that no planning manual or historical precedent could guide them through. Angle 5, Enemy Perception. Nagasaki also reshaped Japan's perception of the United States. Until that moment, GHQ had viewed American forces as formidable, but ultimately containable through attrition, defensive depth, and attritional air campaigns. The atomic bombs shattered that image. Officers began to see the U.S. not merely as a nation with overwhelming industrial and logistical capabilities, but as a power capable of instantaneous, decisive, and nearly surgical destruction. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical devastation. America was no longer just an adversary. It had become an existential force, one that could annihilate entire cities at will, and by extension, the nation itself. This perception amplified the urgency of internal debates. Should Japan continue resistance, knowing the enemy possessed weapons that could strike anywhere with unprecedented precision? Could a single victory on the battlefield offset the strategic supremacy now demonstrated? The High Command was confronted with an enemy whose technological and psychological reach exceeded any prior military experience. Angle 6, Global and Geopolitical Impact. Finally, the timing of Nagasaki intersected catastrophically with global geopolitics. On August 8th, the Soviet Union had declared war on Japan, crossing into Manchuria with overwhelming force. The High Command had once relied on Soviet neutrality as a potential lever in post-war negotiations. That hope was now extinguished. Combined with the atomic threat, the Soviet invasion left Japan strategically encircled and diplomatically isolated. Peaceful negotiations through Moscow were no longer possible. The atomic bombings demonstrated the futility of resistance to the United States, while the Soviets' advance precluded alternative surrender strategies. The convergence of these forces, atomic devastation, the collapse of defensive plans, and the disappearance of diplomatic options brought a profound clarity to the situation. Japan was facing a simultaneous technological, military, and geopolitical collapse. Any continued delay in decision-making risked the complete destruction of the nation. By the end of the morning, the High Command had absorbed a terrifying reality. Japan could no longer continue the war. Tactical calculations were meaningless, leadership cohesion was fragile, human cost was incomprehensible. Technological superiority was overwhelming. The enemy had become omnipotent and global forces were closing in. The stage was now set for the decisive moment, the turning point that would redefine Japan's history and the world itself. August 9, 1945. The morning light barely penetrated the dense clouds above Tokyo, yet inside the Imperial General Headquarters, tension hung heavier than any darkness. Officers moved with mechanical precision, yet the air was thick with the unspoken understanding that the war had entered a dimension that no one had truly prepared for. At precisely 10:58 a.m. local time, the first official telegram from Nagasaki reached the GHQ. It was concise, clinical, and terrifyingly definitive. Nagasaki devastated by aerial bomb. Unprecedented destruction, civilian casualties unknown, immediate verification requested. The message was read aloud, and for a moment the room fell silent. The telegraph machine continued to click, indifferent to the human panic it had delivered. Senior generals, war ministers, and staff officers exchanged glances that required no words. Hiroshima had already been catastrophic. But Nagasaki confirmed the unthinkable. This was not an isolated event. Immediately, the room erupted into methodical verification. Officers began cross-checking reports from local commands, telegraphs from the Western Army District, and reconnaissance data from surviving aerial units. The process was painstaking, slowed by the chaotic communication network still partially disrupted from prior bombings. Yet with each passing minute, the scale of the destruction became undeniable. At approximately the same time the GHQ's morning briefings began in Tokyo, the first scrambled messages from Nagasaki and the Western Army District Command were being prepared. Observers on the ground saw the flash, heard the shock wave, and witnessed the massive plume rise over a city that had been almost untouched compared to other industrial centers. Their first reports were confused, incomplete, and unmistakably catastrophic. Those fragmented transmissions were already flowing toward the capital, flickering through damaged telegraph lines and radio relays, carrying news that would destroy the last illusions of Japan's ability to continue the war. And soon those messages would enter the war room. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, leaned over a large map of Kyushu and western Honshu. His finger traced potential American flight paths, calculations of remaining B-29 squadrons, and target priorities. The results were clear. Nagasaki, like Hiroshima, had been struck with a weapon outside any known precedent. Fortified cities, anti-aircraft emplacements, and dispersed troop formations were irrelevant. Japan's conventional defenses were meaningless against a new category of warfare. At the same time, War Minister Korochika Anami conferred with his senior staff, recognizing the moral and strategic implications. Any continuation of the war risked not just military defeat, but national annihilation. The reports included vivid descriptions of the heat, shock wave, and firestorm, entire neighborhoods wiped out within seconds. It was more than an attack. It was a statement of technological supremacy, a demonstration that Japan's remaining cities were vulnerable to extinction. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, representing the diplomatic perspective, immediately began assessing the implications for surrender. He noted the synchronous disaster, atomic annihilation in the west, and Soviet armored columns advancing from the north. The once hoped-for opportunity to negotiate favorable terms through Moscow had vanished overnight. The High Command convened a rapid, unscheduled session. Officers crowded around maps, reports, and photographs. The usual rigid hierarchy momentarily loosened as the immediacy of the catastrophe demanded collaboration. The question was no longer whether Japan could repel the Americans or withstand further attacks. It was whether the nation could survive another day without total destruction. Yet even in this critical moment, the room was divided. Hardliners argued for continued resistance, proposing last-ditch defenses and mass mobilization of civilians. But the data from Nagasaki left no room for optimism. Casualty estimates, infrastructure collapse, and the scale of human suffering weighed heavily on all decision-makers. By midday, a grim consensus began to form. Japan's ability to continue the war was effectively nullified. Nagasaki had forced the reality that the atomic bomb was no longer a singular terror, but a recurring threat. The United States possessed a capability to annihilate the nation in hours. Traditional notions of honor, sacrifice, and protracted defense could no longer justify continued resistance. And yet, the decision that loomed whether to surrender was not immediate. Protocol demanded consultation, verification, and deliberation with the Emperor himself. The High Command faced the paradox of urgency against procedural necessity. Every passing hour risked additional destruction, yet the weight of culture, tradition, and military code slowed decisive action. Outside the war room, the city of Tokyo carried on in partial calm. Civilians moved among rubble, unaware of the full implications of the telegraphs clicking relentlessly inside the bunker below. Yet for the officers within, time had contracted. Each moment reinforced the realization that the very foundations of the nation were vulnerable. The war, once an extension of Japan's pride and strategy, had become a countdown to destruction. By late afternoon, the reports were consolidated. Nagasaki was verified. The extent of the damage, while still partially unknown, matched or exceeded Hiroshima. The technological, human, and strategic consequences were undeniable. The moment had arrived. The High Command could no longer cling to hope or conventional tactics. They were forced to confront a new reality. Japan's war could not continue. Decisions that had been theoretical were now urgent, irreversible, and terrifying. And in that charged atmosphere, the path toward surrender, toward informing Emperor Hirohito, was set in motion. As afternoon settled over Tokyo, the atmosphere in the Imperial General Headquarters grew increasingly tense. The confirmation of Nagasaki's devastation had transformed abstract fear into stark reality. Officers moved with a purposeful urgency, arranging telegraphs, analyzing reconnaissance, and calculating remaining American operational capacity. Each report, each verified detail, reinforced the undeniable conclusion: Japan could no longer resist. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War convened in an emergency session. This gathering brought together the nation's top military leaders, government officials, and advisors. Traditionally a place of rigid hierarchy and ceremonial procedure, the council now felt like a war room on the brink of collapse. The weight of information pressed upon every member. Nuclear annihilation, the Soviet invasion, and the depletion of resources formed a converging storm. General Anami, war minister and one of the most staunch advocates for continued resistance, remained composed outwardly, but his mind worked through grim calculations. Every remaining division, every civilian conscript, every coastal battery would be obliterated if the Americans continued their atomic campaign. Even heroic sacrifice could no longer guarantee strategic success. His focus shifted to damage limitation, survival, and the preservation of the imperial institution. Umezu, chief of the Army General Staff, presented detailed analyses of troop dispositions across Kyushu and Honshu. The numbers told a harrowing story. Japan had insufficient reserves to repel an invasion, let alone withstand repeated atomic strikes. Anti-aircraft capabilities were depleted, airfields destroyed, fuel and munitions critically low. Every scenario that did not involve immediate surrender led to near-certain annihilation. Foreign Minister Togo emphasized the geopolitical collapse. With the Soviet Union invading from the north and no neutral mediator in sight, diplomatic options had vanished. The Potsdam Declaration, previously dismissed by hardliners as an Allied bluff, now represented the only pathway to avoid total destruction. It demanded unconditional surrender, but the Council recognized that any delay or defiance would result in national catastrophe. Debates were intense. Hardliners argued that Japan could still fight, citing terrain advantages, civilian mobilization, and cultural resolve. Yet the consensus was eroding under the weight of verified reports. Nagasaki had not been a warning. It was a statement of absolute capability. America could and would destroy any city without warning. The mere thought of a third atomic strike on Tokyo or Osaka silenced the staunchest advocates of continued resistance. The turning point crystallized in the Council's recognition that strategic calculations alone could no longer guide decisions. The atomic bomb had altered the very framework of warfare, shifting Japan from a position of tactical consideration to one of existential survival. Within these walls, officers who had spent years preparing for battle now confronted a weapon that defied all precedent. Maps, reports, and troop logs became irrelevant against an enemy capable of annihilating entire cities at will. By late afternoon, a decision emerged, not unanimous in sentiment, but unified in necessity. The High Command acknowledged that further military resistance was futile. The Empire faced total destruction unless it accepted the terms of surrender. The challenge now was to present this decision to Emperor Hirohito, whose authority alone could legitimize the capitulation. Even as plans to inform the emperor were drafted, officers grappled with the psychological shock of the moment. For decades, Japan had fought under a code of honor, duty, and sacrifice. Now, The very survival of the nation required abandoning long-held beliefs about fighting to the death. The High Command was forced to confront a paradox. Surrender was both shameful and necessary, moral and catastrophic. Outside, the city of Tokyo remained a city of partial calm. Civilians moved through streets scarred by prior bombings, unaware of the magnitude of the reports circulating beneath the ground. Yet inside the war room, history was being decided. The realization was complete. Japan's capacity to continue the war had been shattered not by attrition, not by conventional firepower, but by two instruments of unprecedented destruction and a converging geopolitical collapse. By evening, the path forward was clear. The decision to end hostilities, to transmit surrender, and to inform the emperor had been made. Nagasaki had not only claimed lives and cities, it had forced the final pivot in Japan's strategic and moral calculus. And as the last reports were filed, the High Command, for the first time in the war, faced the profound certainty that the conflict they had fought for decades was over. The nation's fate now rested in the hands of the emperor and the fragile hope that surrender could prevent total annihilation. The hours following the confirmation of Nagasaki's destruction were a mixture of solemn deliberation and urgent action within the Imperial General Headquarters. Military calculations, once the sole focus of the High Command, gave way to administrative coordination and the immediate task of informing Emperor Hirohito. The reports from Nagasaki, combined with those from Hiroshima, left no room for debate. Japan could no longer continue the war without total annihilation of its population and infrastructure. Immediate assessments focused on the scale of destruction. Field officers relayed preliminary casualty estimates: tens of thousands of civilians dead, tens of thousands more severely injured. Entire districts had been obliterated. Hospitals, factories, and residential areas were reduced to rubble. Beyond the immediate human toll, the disruption of communications, transport, and administration created a cascading effect of societal collapse. Local authorities were unable to respond effectively, leaving survivors without aid or guidance. Military leaders confronted the reality that Nagasaki, unlike previous air raids, could not be countered by conventional defenses. Strategic fortifications were meaningless. Remaining air units could not intercept high-altitude bombers. Anti-aircraft batteries had little effect. The destructive power displayed in 2 consecutive atomic attacks rendered traditional war planning obsolete. The High Command understood that continued resistance would only invite the complete annihilation of the home islands. Within the Council, debate shifted from tactical feasibility to national preservation. Hardliners who had previously advocated for continued fighting recognized, even reluctantly, that further combat would result in catastrophic civilian losses and likely the end of the imperial institution itself. Diplomats emphasized the necessity of immediate communication with the Allied powers, acknowledging the Potsdam Declaration as the only viable pathway to survival. Reports from the cities themselves reinforced the urgency. Survivors described buildings flattened, entire neighborhoods incinerated, and radiation effects, burning skin, scorched clothing, and lasting physical trauma. The psychological weight of these accounts, coupled with the strategic impossibility of mounting a defense, created a consensus among the Council. Japan had reached the threshold of national catastrophe. The next step was delicate. Protocol required that the emperor, as the supreme authority, be briefed personally. Plans were made to present both Hiroshima and Nagasaki reports to him in precise, factual terms, highlighting the destructive power and the impossibility of resistance. Every officer understood the gravity. The decision rested not solely on military calculations, but on the moral and political authority of the emperor. Even as arrangements were underway, the larger implications were becoming evident. The atomic bomb had introduced a new era of warfare, one in which single weapons could determine the fate of nations. Japan's strategic and military assumptions had been fundamentally upended. The combination of unprecedented technological destruction and the Soviet advance left no remaining paths for negotiation or delay. By the evening of August 9th, the High Command had accepted the reality. Nagasaki, following Hiroshima, was not merely a city destroyed, it was the symbol of a paradigm shift in war itself. The nation had been forced to confront an enemy capable of unparalleled destruction, leaving no alternative but surrender. In the quiet moments after the council adjourned, officers contemplated the enormity of what had just occurred. 2 cities erased, tens of thousands dead, and the nation poised on the precipice of a historic decision. By the evening of August 9th, the decision-making machinery of the Imperial General Headquarters had shifted entirely from resistance to survival. The task before them was unprecedented, translating the shock of Nagasaki into a concrete path towards surrender, while maintaining the fragile social and political structures of a nation on the brink of collapse. The Emperor, Hirohito, would ultimately hold the authority to formalize Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. But before that, the High Command had to compile precise reports on the devastation and the strategic impossibility of further resistance. These reports drew on multiple sources: reconnaissance photographs, survivor accounts, communications from field commands, and telegraphic confirmation of infrastructure collapse. Every detail underscored the same inescapable truth. Japan could not endure another atomic strike. Military leaders faced the task of preparing the armed forces for surrender, a concept nearly unthinkable to men who had trained for total war. Units that had been preparing for last-ditch defense along Kyushu's coastlines were now ordered to stand down. Communication chains relayed instructions to avoid further casualties, minimize destruction, and maintain order. The same officers who had plotted desperate counterattacks just hours earlier were now coordinating compliance with Allied occupation policies, ensuring that chaos did not compound the already overwhelming disaster. The social and moral ramifications were equally profound. For decades, Japanese culture had revered the notion of honor through resistance, often extending to self-sacrifice. Surrender, once seen as the ultimate shame, was now framed as the only path to preserve the nation's remnants. In private, officers wrestled with guilt and disbelief. Publicly, they maintained composure, but the psychological burden was immense. Reports emphasized both the human cost already incurred and the potential catastrophe of continued fighting. Meanwhile, news from the front lines continued to underscore the futility of resistance. Soviet forces advanced rapidly in Manchuria, capturing key positions and dismantling Japanese command structures. Simultaneously, intelligence indicated that more B-29 units were prepared for deployment, capable of delivering additional atomic bombs. The convergence of these forces, American technological supremacy and Soviet military pressure, eliminated any remaining strategic or diplomatic options. Within Tokyo, the civilian population remained largely unaware of the full scope of the crisis. However, the High Command understood that the public reaction to surrender had to be managed carefully. Officials began planning for controlled announcements, preservation of public order, and the maintenance of essential services during the transition from war to peace. The stakes were clear. A mismanaged surrender could result in civil unrest, mass casualties, or further chaos. By nightfall, the Imperial General Headquarters had completed the formalities required to present the situation to Emperor Hirohito. The reports, meticulously verified and horrifying in detail, left no doubt. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had irrevocably demonstrated the destructive capacity of the United States. Coupled with the Soviet invasion, Japan's military and civilian infrastructure were in jeopardy of total annihilation. The conclusion reached by the High Command was unequivocal. The war could not continue. Nagasaki had not only destroyed a city, it had shattered any remaining illusions about Japan's ability to endure. The leadership understood that the path forward was now determined, not by strategy or pride, but by survival, moral necessity, and the authority of the emperor. As Tokyo settled into the night, the war room quieted. Maps, reports, and telegrams were placed aside. Officers reflected on the enormity of what had occurred. 2 atomic strikes, tens of thousands of lives lost, a nation forced to confront the limits of human endurance, and the undeniable inevitability of surrender. The final steps toward ending the war were in motion, and the world would soon bear witness to the consequences of decisions forged in this somber and pivotal moment. Nagasaki was more than a city destroyed. It was a reckoning, a moment that forced Japan to confront the limits of human conflict, the unprecedented power of technology, and the fragility of national strategy in the face of overwhelming force. In the quiet of the Imperial General Headquarters, officers who had spent decades preparing for war now faced a truth that no textbook, no doctrine, and no experience could fully explain. The nature of warfare had changed forever. The atomic bomb did not merely end battles, it ended illusions. Hiroshima had shocked the leadership, but Nagasaki forced clarity. Japan's defenses, strategies, and sacrifices were rendered obsolete in seconds. The High Command, conditioned to measure victory through attrition and tactical maneuvering, was compelled to recognize the incomprehensible scale of destruction and the impossibility of continued resistance. It was a lesson in both power and vulnerability, one that reshaped not only Japan's future, but the global understanding of modern conflict. Yet amid the devastation, there was a lesson in human restraint and decision-making. The calculated deliberations of the High Command, the careful verification of reports, and the eventual acceptance of surrender illustrate the profound responsibility borne by those in power. They were forced to balance honor, survival, morality, and the lives of millions. Decisions made under the crushing weight of unprecedented technology and global pressure. The events of August 9, 1945, stand as a turning point in history. They remind us that warfare is not solely a contest of soldiers and weapons, but a test of human judgment, perception, and adaptability. Nagasaki revealed the ultimate cost of conflict and the fragility of civilization when faced with forces beyond comprehension. In reflection, the lessons endure. Technological innovation can redefine morality and strategy overnight. The human consequences of war are immediate and profound, and leadership demands both courage and humility in the face of unimaginable power. The High Command's response, forced surrender after Nagasaki, was not merely a historical event. It was a profound testament to the limits of human endurance, the weight of responsibility, and the sobering reality that some decisions are defined not by desire, but by necessity. And as the world turned from the ruins of Nagasaki, history was forever altered, carrying with it the quiet, somber lesson that the age of total destruction had arrived, and with it, the imperative to understand, restrain, and reflect.